The words hung in the air of the sun-drenched living room, as out of place as a smear of mud on a silk dress. "We're giving your room to the nanny, Mom," my son Paul said. He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on a spot just over my shoulder, as if rehearsing the line to an invisible audience. His wife, Brooke, stood beside him, a portrait of smug satisfaction, her arms crossed over a blouse that cost more than my monthly pension. "You can sleep in the shed," she added, her voice a saccharine sweet poison. "We'll have it fixed up, of course. Make it cozy." I looked from one to the other, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. This room, this house, was the only home I had ever known since marrying their father, Richard. Every scuff on the hardwood floor, every faint watermark on the ceiling, held a memory. My room, the one Richard and I had shared for 47 years, looked out over the rose garden he had planted for me on our first anniversary. It was where I kept his photograph on my nightstand, where the morning sun would catch the silver in the frame, and for a fleeting moment, I could pretend he was just in the other room. And now, it was to be the domain of a stranger, a nanny for a grandchild I was seldom permitted to see. "A shed?" I finally managed to say, my voice a dry whisper. "It's not just a shed, Mom. It's a guest cottage, a tiny house. It's all the rage," Paul said, finally meeting my gaze with a flicker of annoyance. He had Richard's eyes, but none of his warmth. Richard's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Paul's just narrowed when he was irritated. "We need the space. Little Charlotte needs a proper live-in nanny, and her room must be next to ours. It's the only logical solution." Brooke stepped forward, placing a hand on Paul's arm in a gesture of feigned support. "Evelyn, we're about to leave on a 2-week cruise, a gift to ourselves. We've been working so hard. We need to know Charlotte is in the best possible hands, in the best possible room. You understand, don't you?" I looked past them, through the large bay window, to the backyard. I could see the shed from here. It was a sturdy structure Richard had built with his own hands to store his gardening tools and the lawnmower. It was solid, yes, but it was uninsulated, unplumbed, and smelled perpetually of gasoline and damp earth. The thought of sleeping there, separated from the warmth and history of my home, felt like a final brutal amputation. They weren't just moving me out of a room. They were moving me out of my life, relegating me to the footnotes of their own. I thought of Richard's words, spoken with a grave seriousness in his final days. "Evie, if they ever push you too far, if they ever make you feel like a stranger in your own home, you know what to do." His hand had tightened on mine. "The trust is my final promise to you. Use it." I had thought his fears were an overreaction, a father's worry about a son he knew had a streak of selfishness. I had been wrong. This was the moment he had foreseen. A strange calm settled over me. The initial shock receded, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. I would not fight them. I would not give them the satisfaction of a scene. I would let them think they had won, that the old woman was too frail and defeated to resist. "All right," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I even managed a small, sad smile. "If that's what's best for Charlotte." Paul's relief was palpable. He sagged slightly, the tension leaving his shoulders. "Great. See, Brooke? I told you she'd understand." Brooke's smile was triumphant. "Of course she does. Now, about that cruise. We leave on Friday. We'd be so grateful if you could help us pack. There's just so much to do." "Of course," I repeated, nodding slowly. "I'll help you pack." I would help them pack their bags for their journey into oblivion. The next 2 days were a masterclass in humiliation, which I endured with the quiet dignity of a monarch in exile. My bedroom, my sanctuary, was methodically dismantled around me. Brooke directed the proceedings with the impersonal efficiency of a hotel manager clearing a room for the next guest. She would hold up one of my possessions, a porcelain music box Richard gave me, a collection of my favorite poetry books, and ask, "Do you really need this, Evelyn?" The cottage is quite small. Each question was a small cut. I learned to answer with a simple, "No, dear," allowing her to place my treasures into a cardboard box marked "Donate." Inside, I was a raging sea of grief and fury, but on the surface, I was a placid lake. I was playing a part, the one they had written for me, the meek, compliant, slightly senile old woman who was a minor inconvenience on their path to a more luxurious life. I found a perverse strength in my performance. While Brooke purged my room of my identity, Paul was busy with his own packing. His and Brooke's master suite was a whirlwind of new luggage and designer clothes. He called me in to ask if I knew how to fold his formal dinner jackets the right way. As I stood there, carefully creasing the sleeves of a tuxedo he would wear on a ship I had paid for with the inheritance Richard left me, I had to physically restrain myself from telling him what his father would have thought. Richard was a man of simple tastes and profound integrity. He believed that character was built through hard work and humility, not displayed through brand names and extravagant vacations. He had worried endlessly about Paul's growing obsession with the appearance of wealth over the substance of a good life. "Mom, could you check this for me?" Paul asked, holding out a cruise itinerary. "Does it look like we've scheduled too many shore excursions? Brooke wants to do the catamaran tour and the private beach club on the same day in Barbados." I took the glossy paper, my hands steady. My eyes scanned the details, not for leisure activities, but for crucial information. Departure, Port of New Orleans, Friday, 5 p.m. Ship, Symphony of the Seas. Itinerary, a 7-day Eastern Caribbean cruise, followed by a 7-day Western Caribbean, 14 days in total. 14 days where, for a significant portion of the time, they would be in international waters, beyond the reach of an immediate summons. Perfect. "It looks very busy," I said, handing the itinerary back to him. "You'll need a vacation from your vacation." He laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "That's the point, Mom. You work hard, you play hard." He gestured around his opulent room at the oversized television and the Peloton bike in the corner. This is the life Richard should have given us. He was always so careful, so afraid to live a little. The insult to his father's memory was so profound, so ignorant, that it stole my breath. Richard wasn't afraid to live. He was afraid of what this kind of living did to a person's soul. He had seen the rot in Paul's character long before I was willing to admit it. I simply nodded, a silent gray figure in the background of their vibrant, selfish lives. I helped Brooke zip a suitcase so full of new swimsuits it barely closed. I found Paul's misplaced passport. I played my part beautifully, all while the gears of Richard's final plan began to turn in my mind. Every smile I forced, every quiet nod of agreement, was fuel for the fire that was coming. They thought they were packing for a cruise. They had no idea they were packing for their own eviction. On Thursday afternoon, the day before their departure, the cozy cottage was ready. Paul led me out to the backyard, a proud proprietor showing off a new acquisition. The shed had been hastily converted. The walls were covered in cheap wood-patterned paneling that didn't quite hide the scent of fresh paint and old mildew. A narrow cot with a thin mattress was pushed against one wall. A small electric heater, the kind with glowing orange coils that always made me nervous, sat on the floor. A single bare bulb hung from a wire in the ceiling. They had installed a camping toilet in one corner, hidden behind a flimsy privacy screen. It was a prison cell, decorated with the scraps of their conscience. "See," Paul said, gesturing expansively. "It's got everything you need. We even ran an extension cord for a lamp and your radio." Brooke, who had followed us out, remained at the doorway, wrinkling her nose. It's still a bit rustic, but it's only temporary, Evelyn, until we figure out a more permanent solution. I knew what permanent solution meant. It meant a nursing home, one chosen for its low cost, not its quality of care. This shed was just a stopover on my way to being forgotten completely. I walked into the small, cold space and ran a hand over the rough blanket on the cot. This was where they believed I belonged. This was the value they placed on my life, on my motherhood. I was worth a converted tool shed. I set down the single suitcase they had allowed me to keep from my room. It was an old, leather-bound case of Richard's, filled with the few personal mementos Brooke hadn't deemed worthy of the donation pile. My wedding album, Richard's reading glasses, a bundle of letters we'd written to each other during his Army service. Paul saw me place it by the cot. "Really, Mom? That old thing? It's probably full of moths," he said with a sigh. "Just let it go. We can buy you a new one." "No," I said, my voice firm for the first time in days. "This one stays with me." He shrugged, already losing interest. "Fine, whatever. Just try to keep out of the way tomorrow. We have a car coming for the airport at noon, and it's going to be chaotic." They left me there, standing in the middle of my new pathetic reality. The door clicked shut, and I was alone with the smell of paint and the chilling draft that seeped through the cracks in the floorboards. I looked around the shed at its bare, impersonal walls. They thought they were isolating me, breaking my spirit. They couldn't have been more wrong. In the quiet of that cold little room, I felt Richard's presence more strongly than ever. This was the very scenario he had described, if they ever make you feel like a stranger in your own home. I was no longer in the home, but in an outbuilding, like an old, unwanted piece of furniture. The conditions of the trust had been met. I sat on the edge of the cot and did not cry. Tears were a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I listened to the sounds of the house, their laughter, the television, the life I was no longer a part of, and I waited. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. The main house blazed with light and warmth a world away. Here in the shed it grew dark and cold, but I was not afraid. I was simply counting the hours. Friday arrived, a brilliant sunny Louisiana day that was cruelly at odds with the gloom in my heart. I watched the morning's proceedings from the small, grimy window of the shed. A sleek black limousine pulled into the driveway precisely at noon. The driver, a man in a crisp uniform, began loading an obscene amount of luggage into the trunk. Paul and Brooke emerged from the house, dressed in expensive travel clothes, radiating an aura of excited anticipation. Little Charlotte was with them, holding the hand of her new nanny, a young, stern-faced woman named Nina, who didn't once look in my direction. My role, it seemed, was to be the silent, pathetic figure in the background, a final, dreary tableau for them to glance at before they sped off toward their paradise. Paul caught my eye as I stood in the doorway of the shed. He gave a short, almost embarrassed wave. "Be good, Mom," he called out, his voice thin in the open air. "Don't cause Nina any trouble." Brooke didn't even look at me. She was busy giving last-minute instructions to the nanny, her voice sharp and commanding. Then she turned her attention to her phone, probably posting a photo of the limousine with a caption like, "Off to paradise. Blessed." I gave a weak wave back, playing my part to the very end. The car doors slammed shut, a series of definitive metallic thuds that echoed in the quiet street. The engine purred to life, and the long black vehicle glided away from the curb, carrying my son and his family away from the life they had just destroyed. I stood there, watching until the car turned the corner and disappeared from view. The silence they left behind was vast and profound. The nanny, Nina, took Charlotte inside without a word, closing the front door firmly. The house was once again a fortress from which I was barred. I retreated back into the cold confines of the shed and sat on the cot. Now the most crucial part of my wait began. It wasn't enough that they were gone. For Richard's plan to work with maximum, inescapable force, they had to be beyond reach. I pulled out the small laptop computer they had let me keep, an old model they considered a relic. It took a few minutes to boot up, but soon I was connected to the spotty Wi-Fi signal leaching from the main house. I navigated to a marine traffic tracking website, a tool Richard had shown me years ago when we'd followed a friend's sailing trip. I typed in the name of the ship, Symphony of the Seas. A small icon appeared on the map, docked at the port of New Orleans. I watched it, my screensaver clicking on and off for hours. At 4:55 p.m., the icon began to move. It crawled slowly away from the pier, inching its way down the Mississippi River toward the open sea. I followed its progress, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. I watched it cross into the Gulf of Mexico, leaving the territorial waters of the United States. When the ship's tracker showed it was firmly in international waters, heading east, I knew it was time. There would be no turning back for them, no frantic calls to a lawyer on shore to try and stop what was coming. They were, for all intents and purposes, in another world, a world where they had no power. I closed the laptop. The final piece was in place. My performance was over. The time for action had arrived. The house was dark and quiet, save for a single light on in an upstairs window where the nanny and my granddaughter slept. I left the shed, the cool night air a balm on my skin, and walked not to the back door, but around the house to the grand front porch. I sat on the wicker swing where Richard and I had spent so many summer evenings. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my grief, not just for Richard, but for the son I had raised and lost long before this final betrayal. I had given that boy everything. I had nurtured his dreams, bandaged his knees, and defended him fiercely. And in return, he had banished me to a shed. After composing myself, I walked back to the cold little room that was now my designated space. I took my old rotary-style phone from my suitcase, a sentimental object Brooke had sneered at, and plugged the modern adapter into the extension cord. I preferred it to a cell phone. Its weight felt substantial in my hand. The deliberate act of turning the dial felt more intentional, more real. I dialed the number from memory. It was the private line for Richard's estate lawyer, a man named Franklin Coleman, who had been Richard's friend since college. He had helped Richard draft the trust and was the only other person alive who knew of its secret, powerful clause. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar, even late in the evening. "Coleman." "Franklin," I said, my voice clear and strong. "It's Evelyn Reed." There was a brief pause on the other end, and then his tone shifted, becoming more serious, laced with concern. "Evelyn, is everything all right? I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "Everything is exactly as Richard predicted it might be one day," I said calmly. I stared out the small window at the dark shape of the main house. "I am calling tonight from a converted tool shed in the backyard. Paul and his wife are on a 2-week cruise. They have given my bedroom to a live-in nanny." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with understanding. I could picture Franklin in his study, leaning back in his leather chair, a sad, knowing look on his face. He had known my husband well. He knew Richard's foresight was born from a deep, sorrowful understanding of his own son's character. "The clause," Franklin said, his voice now low and firm. "You wish to activate the clause." "Yes, Franklin," I replied. "I do. Their ship is in international waters. I tracked it myself. They are unreachable." "I understand," he said. "The language of the trust is unequivocal." Richard was very clear. Should my wife, Evelyn Reed, be removed from her primary bedroom and residence within the main house against her will, for any reason whatsoever, full title and ownership of the property located at 330 Rosewood Avenue, along with all associated liquid assets held within the Reed Family Trust, shall be immediately and irrevocably transferred to the Northwood University Alumni Endowment in my name. It also states, he added, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice, that Paul Richard Reed is to be permanently and completely disinherited from any and all parts of my estate, effective from that moment. A single tear, the first I had allowed myself to shed, traced a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of profound aching relief. It was the release of a burden I had carried for years. It was for Richard, for his love, for his foresight, for this final ultimate act of protection. When will it be done, Franklin? I asked. The paperwork is already prepared, Evelyn. It has been waiting in my safe for 5 years. I only need to file it. By Monday morning, the transfer will be complete and legally binding. The house will no longer belong to your son. You, however, are protected. Richard included a life estate clause for you. You have the right to live in the house, in your room, for the rest of your life, with all expenses paid by the new owners. You are safe. Thank you, Franklin, I whispered. Don't thank me, Evelyn, he said gently. Thank your husband. He loved you very much. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness, the silence of the shed no longer feeling like a prison, but like the calm before a righteous storm. 2 weeks crawled by. I lived a quiet, Spartan existence in the shed, interacting with the nanny, Nina, as little as possible. She was efficient and cold, treating me with a distant pity that was almost as insulting as my son's cruelty. I ate the simple meals she left for me on the back step, as if I were a stray cat. I spent my days reading and my nights listening to the radio, waiting. Franklin had called on Monday to confirm it was done. The deed was filed. The accounts were frozen and transferred. The house I was looking at no longer belonged to Paul. He just didn't know it yet. The day of their return was overcast and humid, the air thick with unspoken tension. I was sitting on the porch swing again when the taxi pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a limousine this time. Paul and Brooke tumbled out, looking tanned and tired. The glow of their vacation had already started to fade, replaced by the familiar pall of suburban ennui. They were arguing about a misplaced suitcase as they walked up the path. I told you to check it at the curb, Paul. You never listen to me, Brooke snapped. It's probably just the last one off the carousel, Brooke. Relax, Paul grumbled back. They stopped short when they saw me sitting on the front porch swing. It was a place I had not been allowed to occupy for years, a space they had claimed for themselves. My presence there was an immediate, jarring disruption to their world. Mom? Paul asked, a confused frown creasing his sunburnt forehead. What are you doing out here? I thought we agreed you'd stay out of the way. Brooke's eyes narrowed. Evelyn, why aren't you in your cottage? Nina should be making sure you're comfortable. She swept past me without another glance and pushed open the front door, expecting to walk into the home she owned. Charlotte, sweetie, Mommy's home. Paul hesitated, looking from me to the house and back again. There was a dawning unease in his eyes. He saw something in my calm, steady gaze that he didn't recognize. The frail, defeated woman he had left 2 weeks ago was gone. In her place was someone else, someone he couldn't quite place but who made him deeply nervous. Mom, is something wrong? He asked, his voice losing its confident edge. Everything is fine, Paul, I said, my voice even. Why don't you go inside? There are some people waiting to speak with you. His confusion deepened. People? What people? He didn't wait for an answer. Pushing past me with a new sense of urgency, he stepped into the foyer. I remained on the swing, listening. I heard his footsteps halt abruptly. I heard Brooke's sharp intake of breath. I heard the low, calm voice of a man I knew to be Franklin Coleman. The storm had made landfall. I took a deep, steadying breath and rose from the swing, walking slowly and deliberately toward the front door of my home. It was time for the final act. I entered the foyer to a scene of frozen chaos. Paul and Brooke stood just inside the door, their luggage dropped haphazardly around them. Their sun-kissed hands looked garish under the muted light of the hallway. Opposite them, seated comfortably in the formal living room as if they owned the place, which in a way they did, were two people. One was my lawyer, Franklin Coleman, looking somber and impeccably dressed in a dark suit. The other was a sharp-looking man in a university-branded blazer who held a leather portfolio on his lap. "What is this? Who are you people?" Brooke demanded, her voice high and shrill. She shot a venomous glare at me. "Evelyn, what have you done?" "Please, have a seat, Mr. and Mrs. Reed," Franklin said, his voice cutting through her hysteria with calm authority. He gestured to the sofa opposite them. They remained standing, rigid with suspicion and anger. Paul found his voice. "I'm not sitting anywhere. I want an explanation. What is my lawyer doing in my house with this man? And why is my mother looking like the cat that ate the canary?" "That's the first point of clarification, Paul," Franklin said, his tone icy. "As of last Monday, this is no longer your house." The silence that followed was absolute. Paul stared, his mouth slightly agape. Brooke let out a short, choked laugh of disbelief. "That's ridiculous. We have the deed. Our names are on it." "We're on it," Franklin corrected gently. He opened a file on the coffee table. "Pursuant to a specific clause in the Reed Family Trust, established by your late father, Richard Reed, a breach of contract was triggered 10 days ago. The breach occurred when your mother, Evelyn Reed, the trust's primary beneficiary, was removed from her residence in the main house." He paused, letting the words sink in. The man in the blazer, whom Franklin introduced as Mr. Peterson from the Northwood Alumni Endowment, watched them with a practiced, neutral expression. Paul's face went from tanned to pale in a matter of seconds. What are you talking about? The shed? That was a temporary arrangement. For the nanny, for our daughter. The trust, which you signed as a co-trustee without, I suspect, ever reading the fine print, is exceptionally precise," Franklin continued, his voice relentless. "It makes no distinction for motive. It only states that if Evelyn was removed, the penalty would be immediate and irrevocable. Full ownership of this property and all financial assets held within the trust you have been living off of for the past 5 years, have been legally transferred to the Northwood University Alumni Endowment." Brooke finally collapsed onto the sofa, her face a mask of horror. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Paul turned on me, his eyes wild with a mixture of panic and rage. "You did this. You planned this." Mixture of panic, all that nonsense, acting so meek and helpless. And for the first time, I let my own voice ring out in the room, clear and cold and full of the pain they had inflicted. "You did this, Paul. You and your wife. You did this when you decided your mother was worth less than a nanny. You did this when you looked at the home your father built with love and saw only its monetary value. You did this when you took his legacy of kindness and integrity and traded it for cruises and fancy clothes." I took a step forward. "Your father saw this in you. He saw the greed and the selfishness, and it broke his heart. He didn't create that trust to punish you. He created it to protect me. He created it as a final test of your character, a test I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, that you have failed in the most spectacular way possible. Paul stared at me, speechless. All the bluster, all the entitlement had evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out man who had just lost everything. He finally understood. He hadn't just been dislodged from a house. He had been disinherited by a ghost. The aftermath was as ugly and pathetic as I had expected. Brooke descended into shrieking hysterics, accusing me of being a vindictive, evil old woman. Paul just stood there, cycling through denial, rage, and a dawning, bottomless despair. He tried to argue, to find a loophole. He threatened to sue. Franklin was immovable. You have no grounds, Paul, he stated flatly. You signed the documents. The transfer is legal, binding, and complete. Northwood University and its endowment are the new legal owners of this property. They have been gracious enough to agree to the life estate clause your father included, which means your mother can live here peacefully for the rest of her days. You, however, are now trespassing. That word, trespassing, finally broke him. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a vacant, defeated look. The new owners, through Mr. Peterson, gave them 24 hours to collect their personal belongings and vacate the premises. The cars, the jewelry, the designer clothes, those were theirs. But the house, the money, the life it afforded them, that was all gone. I watched them pack, a process that was a dark mirror of my own a few weeks prior. But where my packing had been a quiet, dignified retreat, theirs was a frantic, angry scramble. They threw clothes into suitcases, arguing in bitter, hushed tones. They were no longer a glamorous power couple. They were just two greedy people whose luck had run out. They didn't speak to me. They couldn't even look at me. In my eyes, they saw not just their accuser, but the reflection of their own failure. The next afternoon, another taxi, not a limousine, not a sleek black car, but a standard yellow cab, pulled into the driveway. They loaded their bags in silence. Little Charlotte, bless her heart, was confused, crying for the home she knew. For a moment, my heart ached for her, an innocent caught in the crossfire of her parents' greed. As Paul was about to get into the cab, he stopped and looked at me one last time. I was standing in the doorway of my home, my true home. There were no tears in his eyes, no remorse. There was only a cold, bitter resentment. I hope you're happy, he said, his voice dripping with venom. I am at peace, Paul, I replied, and it was the honest truth. It's not the same thing as happiness, but it's what your father wanted for me, and it's more than you have. He flinched as if I'd slapped him, then got into the cab without another word. I watched it drive away, carrying them out of my life. The quiet that descended on the house this time was different. It wasn't empty or lonely. It was clean. It was the silence of a fever that had finally broken. That evening, I walked into my old room. Nina, the nanny, had already been dismissed and paid by the estate. The room was exactly as she had left it, impersonal and sterile. But I knew how to fix that. I went to the shed and retrieved my suitcase, the one they had mocked. I took out my wedding album, my books, and the silver-frame photograph of Richard. I placed him on the nightstand, right where he belonged. Richard. The last rays of the setting sun caught the silver, and for the first time in a long time, my house felt like a home again. My home, safe and sound, just as he had promised.